I spent 30 years building my career. Every brick of the Lake Tahoe villa carried the imprint of my hands and of my late wife. Yet one ordinary afternoon, when I arrived at the house, he sat there arrogantly in the chair, legs crossed, arms folded, and coldly declared, "This villa no longer belongs to you, Dad." His triumphant smile, my son-in-law's indifferent gaze, and the cruel silence of her in-laws, all of it pierced my heart like a dagger. They thought I would stay silent, endure it as I had for the past 3 years. But this time was different, and from that moment on, tragedy began to unfold for him. The wind off Lake Tahoe carried more than just the scent of pine and cold mist that evening. It carried a weight, a warning, the kind of chill that didn't simply graze the skin but reached under the collar and down to the bone. My coat did little to stop it. I pulled it tighter, listening to the subtle hiss of the breeze weaving through the tall pines, the faint slap of water against the rocky shore. On the front steps, I stopped short. 2 dried coffee stains streaked across the wood, their shape almost like footprints hastily set down, careless, disrespectful. I crouched to touch them, cold, old enough to have dried but recent enough to feel like an intruder's smirk left behind. The key rattled in my hand. It was my key. The one that had opened this villa for nearly 3 decades, the one Margaret had slipped onto my palm the day we first called this place ours. But the lock resisted. I twisted harder. Nothing. Someone had oiled it recently. The smooth resistance wasn't neglect, it was intervention. A foreign hand had prepared this lock, not mine. The doormat lay crooked, twisted at an angle, not the way Margaret used to straighten it every morning with her slippered foot. It looked wrong, wrong enough that the whole house seemed to tilt with it, as if the villa itself had decided to reject its rightful owner. I rounded the stairwell, every sense strung tight, and then I froze. White bathrobes gleamed in the afternoon sun, bright as ivory, too bright. They dazzled against the shadowed stairwell where I stood like some unwelcome phantom. My daughter Julia leaned casually against the balcony railing, her dark hair shining under the golden light. She looked perfectly at ease, too, at ease. Behind her, Ethan sat with the entitled air of a man who thought he belonged. He lifted his coffee cup with just 2 fingers, dabbed the rim with one of my napkins, and then set it precisely on the same spot Margaret had always preferred. It was a small act, but it struck me like a knife. That place at the railing was hers. My throat tightened, my hands trembled. "Did you mistake the address?" I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. "Or mistake the man who paid for every brick here?" Julia didn't flinch. She straightened with deliberate calm, her chin tilting slightly upward, her face cold and composed. She tapped her fingernails against the porcelain cup, tick, 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 the rhythm precise, almost mocking, as if she were counting down seconds until I disappeared. "Dad," she said, still refusing to meet my eyes, "you're standing in the wrong place in my life and in this house." Ethan inhaled sharply, as though about to interject, but Julia's glance sliced sideways, silencing him instantly. His Adam's apple bobbed. He swallowed his words like a man who had already learned his place in her choreography. I staggered inside myself. Yet even in that moment, I still heard Margaret's laughter echoing in my memory here, on this same balcony, on a long-ago summer night. She had laughed at me for insisting on red kitchen tiles, had kissed me into surrender with the smell of apple pie drifting from the oven. Those echoes hit me harder than Julia's words. Had I really traded away my authority, my boundaries, just to cling to my daughter since Margaret's funeral? I lowered my bag gently, as though its weight might crack the fragile balance of this moment. I lifted both hands, palms open, the way I once did on construction sites when trying to explain blueprints to an impatient crew. "I just want to collect your mother's mail and our wedding album," I said softly, voice barely above a plea. "Then I'll go." Julia turned her back without hesitation. She raised her phone, snapped a picture of the lake, and murmured, "This angle is perfect for tonight." Not once did her eyes touch me, not once. And then, the blow landed. "You're just an obstacle to our weekend background," she said, almost idly. The word obstacle clattered to the floor between us, heavy, final, like dropped keys striking tile. My heart skipped a beat, then dragged, slower, heavier, as if burdened with fresh chains. I knelt beside my bag, fumbling twice before the zipper caught. My right knee cracked sharply, the brittle reminder of my 62 years. Julia didn't even glance down. To her, I was already a relic, an inconvenience in the way of her new life. Dirt on her shoe. Boundaries, I reminded myself, aren't always walls of brick. Sometimes they're doors you have to force yourself to close, even against your own blood. The sliding glass door reflected me back as I turned. The image was warped, faint a tenant overstaying his welcome. Behind me, Julia raised her coffee cup and tapped it once against the railing. Ting! The sound was crisp, deliberate, a mocking toast to my exile. I trudged back to my car. From the rearview mirror hung a ballet slipper keychain, faded pink, worn smooth by time. Julia had worn it at 8 years old. I reached up, brushed it aside for the first time. It dangled, unwanted, in the way. I fastened the seatbelt slowly, my fingers stiff, as though pressing into the next chapter of my life against my will. The buckle clicked with reluctant finality. The phone buzzed once. A notification. The bank asking me to confirm a new transaction at Lake Tahoe, my villa. I darkened the screen, let it vanish into silence, the way the lake swallowed sound on stormy nights. The forest road opened ahead. Pines stood tall and silent, aligned like guards, their backs turned to me. I drove south, toward San Diego. The trunk was empty, but my chest carried a weight heavier than wet concrete. And the thought that pressed on me was as clear as any foundation plan I had ever drafted. If my daughter had laid her foundation in cruelty, then I would rebuild this house in law. Monday evening wrapped the house in a silence so thick it pressed on my chest. In my study, the pendulum clock ticked with merciless precision, each swing and click hammering into the stillness like nails into a coffin. The desk lamp threw a narrow cone of light across a spread of neglected papers, contracts, invoices, scraps of projects long past now covered by a thin veil of dust. They looked less like records of work and more like relics of a man whose best years had been buried alongside his wife. My hand drifted to my wedding band. I twisted it slowly around my finger, the metal cool and familiar, the ritual automatic. For years I'd done it unconsciously, each turn conjuring Margaret's steady presence. Tonight, the motion felt more like clinging to a lifeline than honoring a memory. Then the phone split the silence. The ringtone shrieked into the room, sharp, relentless, like a blade slicing the air in two. I jolted so hard the coffee sloshed over the rim of my cup, dripping onto the half-read newspaper and smearing the ink into illegible gray stains. My pulse spiked, my throat tightened. For one fragile instant, hope bloomed in me. Maybe Julia was calling to apologize. Maybe, against all odds, she'd remembered who I was to her. I answered on the second ring. Her voice came through, clipped and stripped of any warmth. Not the voice of a daughter, but of a negotiator reading off terms. "Dad, Ethan and I have decided. The villa belongs to his parents now." The words landed with the weight of falling concrete. I dragged my chair closer to the desk, bracing myself against its polished edge, as if holding to something solid could keep the rest of me from collapsing. Her tone wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't even a request. It was final, the swing of a hammer against a wall already cracked inside me. "Julia," I said, my voice catching. My fingers trembled, tapping a frantic rhythm on the leather armrest of my chair. The sound was quick, urgent, like war drums beating the start of a battle I hadn't chosen but could no longer avoid. "You're not just taking property, you're burying your mother's memory along with it." A laugh came back at me, brittle and humorless. "You're being ridiculous. After all we've done for you since Mom died." The audacity in her tone made my stomach twist. I opened my mouth to answer, but she pressed on, her words sharp as glass. "You're old and alone. You don't need a house that big." The phrase struck with surgical precision, aimed directly at the softest part of me. I gripped the armrests, knuckles whitening, and the chair beneath me creaked in protest as if it too bore the strain. Old and alone. 3 words, but they echoed like a gavel declaring sentence. Not on my property, but on my fatherhood, on my worth. I drew a breath. steadied the shaking in my chest. My reply came low, iron-edged. No, Julia. For the first time in years, the answer is no. The silence that followed was jagged, almost physical. For a moment I thought she'd hung up. Then came the sound of her breath, ragged, uneven, gusting through the receiver like wind howling down an empty tunnel. Her voice hissed back, venom-laced. If Mom were alive, she'd turn her back on you. My jaw locked, my teeth ground together. Margaret would never condone theft, I said, each word as deliberate as laying bricks into mortar. Her fury burst like a storm on the line. I refused to let it drown me. Before she could fire off another accusation, I slammed the phone onto the desk. The crack of plastic against wood rang through the study like a judge's gavel, ending a trial. The screen went black. In its glassy reflection I saw my own face, hollowed cheeks, lines carved deep, eyes rimmed red as though I'd been awake for 3 nights already. A man whittled down to a shadow by grief, now staring at proof that even his only child could carve deeper still. The study felt smaller with every breath I took, the walls closing in, shadows thickening like an advancing tide. That night, sleep refused me. I turned over and over in bed, the sheets twisting like ropes around my body. Outside, the distant hum of San Diego traffic crept in through the window, muted, restless, like a chorus of unanswered questions. Each time I shut my eyes, the same image returned, relentless. Julia, standing in the villa doorway, her face void of hesitation, shutting me out with the cold efficiency of someone slamming a vault door. Outside, San Diego's evening traffic droned faintly, the rhythm steady and indifferent, like a metronome that had marked the passing of my grief for 3 relentless years. But inside my study, the silence was different. It no longer smothered me beneath its weight. Tonight, it had hardened, transformed into a steel table where I set down the blade of decision. The leather chair groaned beneath me as I leaned back. Past midnight now, the air stale with ink, dust, and the faint bitterness of reheated coffee. The clock on the wall ticked, every beat hammering in another nail to seal away the coffin of old patience. My desk, once buried under years of unanswered requests and folded apologies, now stood divided. Files of my business legacy neatly stacked to one side, and Julia's pile of demands shoved violently to the other, a gesture as final as brushing decades of weakness into the trash. I reached for the civil code. The book cracked open with a dry whisper, as though the spine itself remembered the last time I had studied it in earnest. My fingers turned directly to section 1091, then to section 1214. The marker squeaked across the paper as I underlined phrases: chain of title, consideration, recording priority. Yellow sticky notes fanned out like warning flags on a minefield. What had once been dull legal jargon 30 years ago now shone with clarity: columns, beams, and foundations. But instead of concrete, the framework was statutes, precedents, procedures for recording. My phone lit up on the desk. Notifications pulsed across the screen. Julia typing, then gone. Julia typing, then gone again. A ghost of conversation that never quite formed. I let them pile up without response, my thumb swiping left to archive them, each message sliding off the screen like loose bricks tumbling from the wall I was rebuilding. I read every word, but offered none in return. Silence was my deposition, my official record. By Wednesday morning, resolve had sharpened into action. I sat across from Daniel Wu in his glass-walled office overlooking the bay. Outside, sail masts shifted, their shadows cutting slow arcs across the rippling water. Inside, a printer hummed, spitting paper in steady bursts, each sheet landing with the weight of a verdict. "I need a legal roof heavy enough," I said evenly, "that if anyone tries to crush me with it, they'll break themselves instead." Daniel adjusted his glasses and nodded once, his pen scratching swiftly across the legal pad. The sound was brisk, confident, the sound of strategy taking shape. I uncapped my own pen, pulled out the yellow pad I had carried through decades of construction projects, and scrawled 3 bullets in block letters: coercion, timelines, contemporaneous notes. The project manager in me was back, resurrected from dormancy. Every task had to be stamped, every event dated, every word documented. What I had once excused as family duty, the law defined with clinical detachment, attempted undue influence. Later, in the elevator, fluorescent lights fractured my reflection in the mirrored walls. I saw two men staring back, one hollowed by surrender, the other sharpening into a strategist. The doors slid open, and only one of those men walked out. The phone buzzed again in my pocket, insistent. Julia's voice poured through the speaker, sharp and laced with the entitlement I knew too well. "You could be generous." "I will be generous," I said, pressing the call to speaker, tapping the record function, and laying the phone atop a folder marked LT Villa title. "I will be generous with the law. They're struggling, Dad. Margaret lost her job. Ethan's father can't pay rent. They need the villa." "Financial hardship," I replied, voice flat as steel, "is not a passport across the border of ownership." There was silence for a moment, then I heard her breathing stutter, quicken, spiral into ragged gusts like a storm funneling through the receiver. When the call ended, I pulled open the drawer at my side and lifted out a thick stack of receipts. Each was stapled, dated, annotated in my own hand. Wedding $15,000, SUV $25,000, grad school $40,000. Every page carried the same signature, Dad. The pattern screamed its truth like a graph carved in stone. Each "I need" grew larger, each "thank you" shrank smaller. Gratitude wasn't just dwindling, it had plummeted. And then, in the hush of that moment, Margaret's voice stirred in my memory. Not the soft whisper that had lulled me into patience for years, but sharper now, harder, no longer consolation, but command. "Don't be a victim anymore." It wasn't permission, it was a starter pistol. I pulled a blank sheet from the pad and began sketching timelines, as if laying out a construction bid. T-4, T-3, T-2, tasks assigned, risks registered, fallbacks noted. My pen carved the problem down to its studs, scraping away years of emotional mortar that had glued me into weakness. I wrote the principles down plainly, each one like a beam locking into place. Principle 1. Desperate men sign bad deals. I am not desperate. Principle 2. Information is leverage. Gravity pulls for me. Principle 3. Time is the master builder. 6 days is enough to raise a steel frame. I set the pen down and opened my phone's contacts. My thumb hovered over a name that glowed on the screen like a dormant switch. Ryan Parker, Basement Flood 2024. Julia had no idea what 5% of me looked like, but on Sunday morning she would hear it. Not in words, but in action, relay by relay, sensor by sensor, statute by statute. By 2 o'clock in the morning, my plan no longer lived as sketches on paper. It stood like a steel scaffold rising out of the dark. The hand-drawn schedule lay open across my desk, each empty box like an open mouth waiting to be filled. T-4 for legal fortification, T-3 for technical preparation, T-2 for staging the battlefield, T-1 for camouflage. The clock's second hand swept forward, indifferent, but every click drove me closer to the hour of execution. The following morning, I rapped on Ryan Parker's garage door. It opened with a metallic groan, releasing a rush of air that smelled of cold coffee, solder, and 3D printer resin. His workspace was a chaos that only he could understand. Breadboards tangled with wires, coils of Cat6 cable bundled in black ties, sensors scattered like dice across the bench. On one wall, a monitor glowed with a frozen frame from his last experiment, a door sensor triggering a cascade of lights across a model house. "I need a house that defends itself," I said, my voice steady. "Nothing that breaks the law, but something unforgettable." Ryan's eyebrows arched, and he leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping the edge of his mug. I unfolded the villa's floor plan onto his table. With my red pen, I drew thick circles around choke points, narrow hallways, and camera blind spots. Every stroke carved intent into paper. Ryan studied the marks, his grin spreading. "Not just defense," he murmured. "You want theater." By noon, our SUV sagged low on its suspension, transformed into a mobile arsenal. Inside lay a catalog of tools that looked innocuous in pieces, but terrifying in combination. A dozen motion sensors, 6 Zigbee smart hubs, 4 solenoid valves, 3 compact PCs, 200 meters of programmable LED strips, a rooted tablet, 8 recessed speakers, 6 battery-backed cameras. Each case clicked shut with the weight of inevitability. The vehicle wasn't just carrying equipment, it was hauling an entire laboratory of fear. At the villa, Ryan swept the rooms with a Wi-Fi sniffer, the device chirping as he mapped dead zones and interference. "Weak signal here," he muttered, marking it with tape before repositioning the router channel. He hid secret QR codes behind picture frames and inside cabinet doors, shortcuts that let us access any node in seconds. Motion sensors slipped neatly into lamp housings. False outlets swallowed the rest. LED strips ran along crown moldings and baseboards, blending so seamlessly they seemed part of the original design. We tested the voice module first. The speaker filled the villa with a flat, clinical calm. "System notice. This property belongs to David Morales. Unauthorized occupancy will be recorded." The effect was chilling precisely because it was so calm. Ryan looked at me and nodded once. We built the reaction sequence in 4 distinct layers. Layer 1, lights flickering, a soft but unmistakable warning. Layer 2, directional sounds bouncing unpredictably, paired with shadows projected where no one stood. Layer 3, every faucet and shower bursting open, water hammering pipes as the system issued urgent commands. Layer 4, the smart locks tightening for 30 seconds, enough to choke panic into anyone still trapped. The strobe program we coded didn't flash in simple rhythm. It pulsed in patterns of 3, 2, 1, then paused irregularly, unpredictable, impossible for the brain to anticipate. And all of it remained perfectly legal. No electricity beyond household current, no chemicals, no traps that could physically harm. Light, sound, and water, the ordinary tools of a modern smart home, rearranged into weapons of dread. "It won't hurt anyone," Ryan said, wiping his hands on his jeans, "but it'll tear their confidence to pieces." Our first test confirmed it. The strobes lashed the room with light until my pupils shrank to pinpricks. The plumbing groaned as every faucet and showerhead erupted, the floor humming with pressure. Over the chaos, the system's voice cut through in a steady monotone. "Security alert level 2. Unauthorized activity persists. Recording in progress." Behind the breaker panel, 2 LiFePO4 batteries hummed quietly, 48 volts each, inverted into pure sine wave current. The backup could power the house for 96 hours without the grid. On my phone, a floor plan glowed with red dots marking movement, each figure tracked like prey. Sliders let me raise volume in one wing, buttons labeled flood, freeze, escalate waited under my thumb. By the next afternoon, Ryan pushed the boundaries further. He introduced frequencies under 20 Hz, too low for the ear but heavy enough for the body to feel. A faint vibration rose in my ribs, the kind of pressure that made skin crawl without explanation. He programmed the projectors to cast shadows that ignored their sources, figures that stalked intruders instead of following the light. On the front door, we mounted a polished aluminum sign, the final touch of fair warning. "Welcome to the house of the future. Enter at your own risk." This property uses experimental interactive automation. We snapped photographs of the sign in place, time-stamped them, stored copies in the cloud. Proof of notice. No one could claim ignorance. Our final rehearsal ran through every scenario. Scenario A. If intruders froze still, the house whispered warnings every 45 seconds, looping just long enough to erode sanity. Scenario B. If they bolted in panic, the system escalated mercilessly, strobes spinning, voices chasing from speaker to speaker, shadows lunging out of walls. The algorithm randomized sequences so no cycle repeated within 20 minutes. The house itself became unpredictable, alive. When I turned the doorknob to leave, the magnetic lock clicked shut with a sound so small it could be missed, but to me it was sharp, final, like the closing of a chapter. The villa lay calm, its windows glinting in the evening sun, pretending innocence. But I knew better. Beneath its wooden skin, the mesh of sensors inhaled and exhaled, a beast resting in ambush. Ryan stood beside me, his grin stretched wide, eyes sparkling with mischief. "Your guests," he whispered, "are going to get the surprise of their lives." Sunday, May 4th, the day Julia had chosen for her grand victory. In my study, the room felt like a command center. The computer's cooling fan hummed softly, the blue LED glow sweeping across the keyboard like the steady breath of a night watch. I pulled the curtains, switched off the overhead light, and let only the glow of 3 monitors shimmer against my coffee cup. Its surface trembled, a tiny pool of water waiting for the storm. At 2:28 in the afternoon, the minivan rolled up the gravel drive. Tires crunched stones, a sound that belonged to the owner, not intruders. They stepped out as if the contract had already been signed, not as if they had opened the wrong door. Julia adjusted her jacket. Ethan stretched, and behind them Robert and Helen Hayes carried bags with the confidence of people moving in, not visiting. Then came the warning sign. Helen tugged hard. Plaster dust flaked like snow as the bolts ripped free. I snapped a screenshot from the feed, time-stamped for record. She sneered. "A new home doesn't need silly warnings." She kicked the sign aside like a memory she didn't want. Palmer wiped his shoes unconsciously on the welcome mat. The habit of an owner then reached to flip the light switch as though it were already his. Julia's voice carried through the entryway. "Pick any room you like. This is our house now." I let them settle. They rifled through the kitchen, pulled down 2 mugs etched with E and F Tahoe. Helen washed them quickly and placed them on the wrong shelf, disrupting the order Margaret had once insisted on. I wrote a note in my pad. They touched the keepsakes. Another red line across my final boundary. When the red dot blinked on my phone at the bedroom door, I leaned forward. It was the heartbeat of trespassers. I placed my finger on the execute button, breathing out softly. A pulse of light traced across the digital floor plan. The house woke up. The first wave. Strobe lights flickered 3 quick bursts, then one slow, irregular, impossible for the brain to anticipate. Security notice. Ownership confirmed. Leave the premises. The speakers carried an undercurrent below 20 hertz, too low to hear but enough to twist the stomach. The second wave came with water. Pressure surged through the pipes, rattling the walls. Showers exploded into mist, spreading fine spray into the hallways. Projectors cast shadows that moved opposite the light, as though the house itself carried its own moon. Ethan rushed to the breaker panel, yanking it open only to find a false magnetic cover. He cursed, sprinted to the basement. On my screen, the backup battery icon shifted from 100 to 99%. The system didn't even blink. The third escalation. The smart locks delayed 30 seconds, a slow fist tightening. The entry light shifted from red to amber, pulsing before it flickered green, just long enough for fear to blossom wide. Above Julia, phantom footsteps pounded across the ceiling beams, then stopped directly overhead. The crescendo hit before dawn. Julia spun in the living room, hands over her ears, face fractured by flashing light. Water roared, shadows lunged, voices overlapped in concrete layers. Light, sound, water, projection, burying every gap in reason. At last, when the locks released, Ethan nearly ripped the handle from the frame. Helen clutched her slippers, dropping the car keys twice as her hands shook. They didn't walk out, they slid out, like the house had spat them back. At 7:30, my phone rang. Julia's name glared across the screen. I set it on speaker beside Margaret's framed photo. Our reflections merged on the dark glass. Her voice came ragged, trembling with rage and exhaustion. "What did you do, you sick old man?" "If anything," I said gently, "perhaps the house just refused to endure any longer." "It was horrifying," she screamed. "Lights, water, voices telling us to leave all night long." "4 people saw the same thing?" I asked softly. "Mass hysteria is a fascinating study, Julia." "You did this. I know you did." I chuckled lightly. "Julia, I spent the night in San Diego. Maybe the villa has a will of its own." She sobbed once, then hissed. "We will never come back. That cursed place is yours, But don't think you're innocent. Somehow, we'll prove it." "Prove what?" I asked. "That you had an overnight stay the house didn't approve of?" Silence stretched, long and heavy. Finally, I ended the call with words cold enough to close the act. "You said the villa was yours last night?" The house said otherwise. "You asked for a homecoming." The house answered like a host. The phone rang at exactly 7:30, Julia's name blazing across the screen like a flare of unfinished war. I set it on the desk beside Margaret's framed photo, the glass reflecting both our faces in one dark pane. Her voice spilled out ragged and furious, a mixture of exhaustion and venom. "You set us up, you sick old man. That house was a trap." I leaned back, fingers laced across my stomach, my tone calm, practiced in restraint. "Julia, I don't know what you're talking about. Perhaps it was a technical glitch. Houses have a way of misbehaving when mistreated." Her sob burst through the speaker, raw, strangled, vibrating the receiver as though grief itself shook the line. Before I could answer, she hung up, the silence after her fury deeper than any storm. But the nightmare was not finished. By late morning, the villa's cameras caught the follow-up strike. Ethan's truck rolled up the gravel drive, dust curling around the wheels. He climbed out with a hired locksmith, a man whose weary shoulders already sagged from years of broken latches and jammed deadbolts. Through the microphone, I heard the shuffle of tools, the clink of picks and drivers, the occasional muttered curse. Then the sigh long, heavy, the sound of defeat. "This isn't a normal lock, sir," the locksmith muttered. "It's integrated. Biometric scanner, wireless module, backup power. I can't swap this out." And Ethan's voice cracked with anger. "Then force it." A pause, the clatter of tools falling silent. Then the resignation. "Not without tearing the whole system down. That's beyond me." Ethan folded his arms, stamping his foot against the porch like a spoiled child denied a toy. His jaw clenched, and he spun away, fists tight at his sides. Moments later, the cameras watched him collapse into the truck, shoulders heaving. He pounded the steering wheel 3 times, each thud echoing through the microphone like the drumbeat of frustration. His eyes stared blankly into the rearview mirror, hollow, defeated, before he finally turned the key. On his way out, rage flared. One last time, he lashed a vicious kick at the doorframe. But the cold metal didn't yield. It only gave back a sharp clack, an indifferent echo recorded and archived. I closed my notebook with deliberate care, then reopened it, jotting the entry with the precision of a project manager. T-36 hours. They'll come to my house. T0. Decision. Project management or family warfare, the process was the same. Deadlines, escalation, resolution. By evening, the prediction matured into reality. The first knock on my front door landed heavy, like a stake driven into earth. The second rattled the glass panes, sharp vibrations running through the frame. Julia's voice pierced through the wood, shrill and commanding. "Open the door! You can't hide forever behind cheap machines!" I unlocked it slowly, deliberately, and stood calm in the threshold. Ethan surged forward immediately, his frame filling the doorway. Both hands braced on either side of the frame, he leaned close enough for me to smell the bitter sting of stale coffee on his breath, hot with rage. His eyes, bloodshot, locked on mine. Behind him, Julia swept past, heels clacking hard against the wood floor. She paced in jagged lines, back and forth across the foyer, her sharp steps striking like hammers, as if each one could stamp ownership into my home. Ethan's voice dropped, low and threatening. "Either you sign over the villa, or you lose your daughter forever." Julia lifted her phone, the screen flaring bright. She held it like a judge with a gavel. "I'm recording this. The court will hear every word. We'll paint you as a harasser, no matter what the police did or didn't find." She circled nearer, her venom sharpened to a blade. "If I ever have children, they will never know a grandfather like you, a man this disgraceful." Ethan set a hand on her shoulder, steadying her not as a husband protecting a wife, but as a co-conspirator bracing a partner in cruelty. I lifted my hand and brushed the edge of my wedding band. 3 years ago, I would have clutched it tight, tears pooling. bargaining for reconciliation. But the grief well was long dry, only cold steel remained, firm against my skin. My voice carried steady, stripped of tremor. 3 years ago you would have seen me collapse. Today, you only see me standing tall. Julia's eyes burned like coals, her lips quivered with words that failed to form. Ethan shifted back one step, the retreat breaking their stance of intimidation. The silence turned brittle. Julia's whisper came sharp, almost a hiss. "This isn't over." "It's over," I replied quietly. "You just haven't read the last line yet." Their retreat was as violent as their arrival. Ethan wrenched the truck's door open, the gust scattering papers from my desk near the window. Julia climbed in silently, her phone clutched so tight her knuckles blanched, but her lips remained pressed shut. The taillights glowed crimson, furious, two angry eyes glaring back as the truck reversed down the drive. Then, the corner swallowed them, the glow extinguished, leaving only the night and the echo of their threats. Tuesday morning confirmed what I had sensed for weeks. Julia and Ethan had burned through every scheme, every threat, every gambit. All they had left was direct confrontation, the desperate final card of people who believe intimidation will always win. That evening, in my study, I reached for the silver frame on my desk. Margaret's smile stared back at me, calm and steady, frozen in a photograph taken on a sunlit afternoon when the world had still felt safe. I brushed the edge of the frame with my thumb and whispered into the empty room, "Tomorrow isn't just paperwork. It will be the verdict, public, permanent, and undeniable against their greed." I slept that night without tossing, without dreams. The silence was no longer a predator, it was an ally. By 10 o'clock Wednesday morning, I sat inside the polished conference room of Stephen Grant, my notary and ally for 15 years. The space felt like a chamber of judgment. Polished oak gleamed beneath the overhead lights, its lacquer reflecting every face like a mirror. The scent of fresh ink and paper drifted faintly through the air, sharp and sterile, a perfume of legality. The atmosphere was not that of a casual meeting, it was a courtroom without a jury, and I was ready to let the evidence speak. The door swung open. Julia entered first, her heels clicking hard against the floor, a declaration of defiance. Her chin was lifted high, her posture proud, but her hands betrayed, her fingers twisted together so tightly that the knuckles blanched white. Behind her came Ethan, stiff with confidence, arms folded across his chest like a soldier standing guard. His fingertips tapped against his biceps, sharp, impatient beats like a commander waiting for subordinates to obey. Trailing them were Robert and Helen Hayes. Robert's shoulders sagged, his suit wrinkled from restless nights, his face caught somewhere between grim hope and quiet dread. Helen clutched her handbag on her lap as though it were a lifeline, her lips pursed so thin they seemed ready to vanish. They both wore the look of gamblers who had staked everything and already sensed the cards were turning against them. Saturday, the tension thickened. Julia broke it with a whip of her voice. "No more games," she snapped, slamming her palms onto the table. "Sign the papers. The villa is ours." Ethan leaned forward, his tone low and cutting. "You've delayed long enough, Morales. One signature, and this ends. That's all it takes." I didn't move. Instead, I tilted my head slightly toward Stephen. With practiced precision, Stephen rotated a heavy folder across the gleaming table. The metallic clasp clicked as it opened. The sound was crisp, final, like the flip of a card in a poker game that revealed the trump. His voice was calm, but each word struck with surgical weight. "Mr. Morales cannot transfer the villa to you, because he has already transferred it, legally and irrevocably, to another party." For one long heartbeat, silence crushed the room. Then Julia's face darkened crimson, veins at her temple pulsing. Just as suddenly, the color drained away, leaving her pale, her lips trembling. The chair beneath her groaned as her body shuddered, as though even the furniture rebelled against her fury. "Impossible," she spat. "You betrayed us, betrayed your own family." Ethan's composure shattered. He slammed his palm onto the table so violently that a neat stack of documents slid off, scattering across the polished floor. Stephen, unflustered, bent down with measured calm and aligned them back into order, the embodiment of the law's indifference to tantrums. Ethan's voice broke into a ragged roar. "We built our future on that villa. You've destroyed everything." Helen gasped, twisting the strap of her handbag until her knuckles shook, her eyes glistening with the despair of someone who realized the last refuge she had clung to had dissolved. Robert leaned forward, his voice low, hollow, broken. "So, it was all just an illusion. We never had anything in the first place." Julia's nails raked faint white scratches into the glossy surface of the table as she bowed her head. Her voice emerged like venom dripping from a blade. "This isn't justice. This is hatred. Pure, calculated hatred." I leaned forward at last, my hands folded on the table, my tone colder than steel. "You call it hatred, I call it justice, and justice does not negotiate." Her last defenses cracked. The fire in her eyes flickered, then guttered out. She shoved her chair back, its legs screeching against the polished floor, and rose to her feet. Each strike of her heels toward the door was sharp, angry, like a drumbeat announcing retreat. At the threshold, I delivered my parting words, the true verdict. "Next time you think of manipulating someone, Julia, try a man who hasn't spent his life living by contracts." The door slammed behind them with a finality that echoed like a gavel. The war was over. For the first time in years, I breathed deeply in the silence, and it no longer tasted of grief. It tasted of peace. Thursday morning arrived with a softness I hadn't felt in years. The first rays of light broke over the horizon, spilling across the lake like molten gold. It was the first sunrise in 3 years that I could meet without a knot in my chest, without the armor of anger or the reflex of defense. As my car turned onto the gravel drive, the sound of stones crunching beneath the tires rose like a forgotten melody. The towering pines flanking the road swayed gently, their branches rustling in the cool breeze as though a battalion of soldiers were saluting the rightful owner returning from a long campaign. The villa stood waiting, no intruders, no shadows of betrayal, just the home I had built with Margaret, silent and resolute. When I slipped the key into the lock, it turned smoothly, and the sharp snap of the bolt sliding open rang out with startling clarity. It was a sound so simple, so ordinary, yet it echoed deeper than any shouted declaration of victory. It was mine again, not through violence, not through compromise, but through endurance. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine wood and faintly of dust, but not of fear. The time had come to lay my weapons down. Ryan Parker and I had built a fortress of technology, a house that could defend itself with lights, sound, and steel nerves. But its job was done. Each time I removed a sensor from its hidden cradle, I placed it gently into a padded box, as if retiring a weapon after a war. Every camera I unscrewed, every cable I wound into neat coils, carried the same ritual weight. The circuits clicked dark one by one, like stars extinguishing at dawn. Within 2 hours, the transformation was complete. No blinking LEDs behind picture frames, no microphones tucked inside vents, no strobing lights lying in wait. The house was bare again, not a stage for revenge, not a trap disguised as home, but simply what it had always meant to be, a place of memory, a place of rest, a place untouched by intrusion. I brewed coffee in the machine that had survived the siege, the same machine that only days earlier had witnessed chaos and shrieks. Now it hissed softly, obedient and familiar. Carrying the mug to the terrace, I lowered myself into the old wooden chair. Its frame groaned in protest, creaking in the same rhythm it had for decades. Margaret had once called it the Song of Peace. The sound made me smile. Steam rose from the mug, mingling with the resin-rich air of the pines, carrying upward into the cool morning. I closed my eyes. The lake answered in its own way, gentle lapping at the edge, a lullaby composed only for mornings like this. In my memory, Margaret came to me, not as a ghost, not as a whisper muffled by grief, but as a vivid presence. Her head tilted in that knowing way, her eyes steady, her smile calm with quiet certainty. For the first time, her voice was not fragile or fleeting. It was resolute. "You've come back, David," I whispered back, not in weakness but with conviction. "Kindness without boundaries is nothing but a trap." The words hung in the air, not as bitterness, but as truth finally recognized. Nature itself mirrored the lesson. A single bird dipped onto the lake's surface, ripples fanning outward in perfect circles. For a few seconds the water trembled, disturbed, only to smooth itself back into glass, whole again, as though nothing had broken it. Recovery, boundaries, renewal, all in the rhythm of the lake. Beyond, the mountains stood with their reflections etched deep into the water, immovable, steady, reminding me that true strength lies not in force, but in consistency. I touched my chest. My heartbeat was slow, even, grounded, not racing with fury, not clenched in pain, simply alive, steady, present. For the first time in 3 years, Margaret's voice no longer bled through Julia's accusations. For the first time, I no longer mistook surrender for love. I heard only myself. This was not the end of a war. It was the rebirth of peace, a peace that had been earned, not granted. It had not come through vengeance, though vengeance had its hour, but through rediscovered boundaries. Through the realization that true love, whether for a wife's memory or for oneself, is not about surrendering everything. It is about protection, about standing guard over what should never be stolen. The sun climbed higher, casting its warmth across the rippling lake and the quiet terrace. I remained seated in stillness, no longer a widower broken, no longer a man defined by loss, but one reborn through clarity. Margaret would have been proud not because I had fought, but because I had remembered who I was. And as I finished the last sip of coffee, I knew one thing with certainty. This chapter had ended, not in reconciliation, but in resolution. And that was the end of my battle, not with walls and signatures, but with myself. I had to learn that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's surrender. The villa became my reminder that peace is not something given by others, it is something we reclaim for ourselves. If this story touched you, let me ask, what boundaries in your life are you ready to defend? Share your thoughts below. Your voice matters here. And if you found meaning in this journey, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next chapter. Click on the box to the left of your screen to step straight into the next story. Thank you for walking with me through this one, and until we meet again, guard your peace, guard your worth.